The excavation team stopped breathing as the monolithic structure powered on, its carvings glowing with an eerie, pulsing light. Every translator failed, every algorithm broke. The message was old. Too old. Then, from the darkness, a low voice muttered in disbelief. "I know this language." The team turned to the lone human in the room. Captain Elias Kale, a disgraced warfighter and Earth's last chance at survival, stared at the ancient text with growing horror. Because the words on the stone weren't just a warning. They were a battle cry. And they were meant for humanity alone. The chamber was silent, save for the quiet hum of scanning drones. Alien archaeologists, clad in lightweight exosuits, surrounded the monolith. It loomed over them like a tombstone, its surface etched with something ancient, something unknowable. Zalran, the expedition leader, ran his clawed fingers over the inscriptions, his mandibles clicking in irritation. "Useless. None of our lexicons recognize it." A holographic projection flickered as a Yilthan linguist tapped at his tablet. "No match in any known galactic database. This script predates even the oldest records of the Union." A shadow fell over them. A single, armored figure stood at the entrance of the chamber, hands bound, expression unreadable. Elias Kale barely spared them a glance before setting his eyes on the monolith. The symbols glowed in the dim lighting, and a cold feeling settled in his gut. He knew the script. His voice cut through the silence like a blade. "I can read it." The aliens turned as one. Zalran's compound eyes narrowed. "Impossible. How could a human recognize what even the elders cannot?" Kale ignored him. He stepped forward, his boots echoing against the stone. The writing was old, primitive in structure yet eerily familiar. His pulse pounded in his ears as his mouth moved before his brain could stop him. "We rose to the stars," he whispered. A chill swept through the room. The monolith's surface pulsed once, like it was alive. "We reached into the void." Energy crackled along the engravings, the light creeping outward in jagged veins. Distant machinery groaned, like the dead planet itself was waking up. And then he awoke. The room shuddered. A deep, bone-rattling vibration rumbled from the walls. The inscriptions, once cold, now burned like fire. Zalran hissed, stepping back. "Human, what are you?" Kale didn't stop. He couldn't. The words poured from him like a prophecy already written. The price was paid in blood. The cycle repeats. The moment the final word left his lips, the ground beneath them trembled. A burst of energy surged from the monolith, knocking over equipment, scrambling scanners. The drones fizzled out, their circuits fried. The air tasted of static and something ancient, something wrong. The projection screens flared to life, streaming unreadable data. Kale's wrist strained against the restraints, but he barely noticed. His mind reeled. This wasn't just a warning. It was a reminder. Zalran's mandibles twitched as he watched the readings spike. His voice came in a sharp click. "Explain." Kale forced himself to breathe, to push past the pounding in his skull. His throat was dry, but his words came out steady. "This message isn't about the end of civilization," he said, his gaze locked onto the monolith. "It's about something that destroys civilizations." Silence. Then the Yilthan scientist murmured. "The cycle." Zalran stiffened. "The supposed pattern of extinction?" "Superstition." Kale laughed, humorless. "Is it?" He gestured at the pulsing monolith. "Because that sure as hell doesn't look like superstition to me." A sharp trill of alarms rang through their comms. Static, then a guttural voice from the expedition's main ship. "Commander Zalran, we have an urgent situation. The Union High Council has intercepted our findings. They demand immediate transmission of the inscription's contents." The room fell into an uneasy hush. Zalran didn't respond immediately. His antennae twitched, calculating. Finally, he tapped his communicator. "Send the data." "Full encryption." Kale's jaw clenched. He knew what that meant. The Union wasn't just watching. They were afraid. A cold certainty settled in his gut. They had known about this message before. Zalron turned toward him. Tell me, human. His tone was measured, but his posture screamed tension. Why does an ancient relic speak of your kind? Kale exhaled, the weight of the truth pressing against his ribs. His voice came out low, almost grim. Because we've seen it before. The room snapped to attention. Zalron took a step forward. Impossible. Kale's lips curled into something between a smirk and a grimace. Yeah, well, you'll have to forgive me if I don't trust the Union's definition of impossible. The alarm shifted in pitch, sharp and urgent. The voice over comms returned, this time shaking with barely contained panic. Sir, we have multiple Union dreadnoughts entering orbit. This isn't a standard request, it's a lockdown. They're activating quarantine protocols. Kale swore under his breath. He had expected surveillance, maybe diplomatic leverage, not a full-scale military lockdown. They weren't just trying to control this information. They were trying to erase it. Zalron's mandibles clicked erratically as he processed the implications. They believe this message confirms the cycle. Kale didn't need to ask. He already knew the answer. If the Union thought this monolith proved the existence of the cycle, Earth was already marked for destruction. The pieces clicked into place. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't coincidence. The Union had been waiting for this moment. Kale rolled his shoulders, testing the restraints on his wrists. Time to leave. His muscles tensed. You're not actually planning to sit here and wait for them to drop an orbital strike, are you? Zalron hesitated. His mandibles twitched. Kale pounced. You're a scientist. You wanted the truth, didn't you? He nodded toward the monolith. Well, now you have it. The Union's been lying. Covering this up for centuries. Why? Zalron's hesitation cracked. Suspicion bled into his gaze. Kale pushed harder. They don't fear the cycle. They fear what happens if we break it. The dreadnoughts were closing in. Minutes left. Kale inhaled. Last chance? You can let them bury this. You can let them turn Earth to glass. His eyes locked onto Zalron's. Or you can help me stop them. The moment stretched, razor thin. Then, Zalron sliced through Kale's restraints. Kale grinned, shaking out his wrists. Knew you were smarter than you looked. Zalron ignored him, already barking orders. Scramble evacuation teams. Wipe the ship's logs. The monolith pulsed one last time, as if aware of what came next. Kale flexed his fingers, rolling his neck. Now, the real fight began. The cold interior of the warship rattled as Kale tightened the stolen combat vest over his torso. The air smelled of fuel, metal, and tension. Across from him, Zalron moved swiftly, his mandibles clicking as he activated the ship's jump drive interface. The screen flashed red, no escape routes available. They've locked the system, Zalron muttered, his claws moving over the controls with growing frustration. We cannot jump. The Union is already deploying blockade ships. Kale strapped a pulse rifle across his back, cracking his neck. Then we don't run. We fight our way out. Zalron's eyes flicked toward him, skepticism and something close to admiration warring in his expression. You are aware we are aboard a research vessel? We are outgunned, outnumbered, and… Yeah, Kale interrupted, adjusting the forearm holster on his left wrist. But here's the thing, you guys don't fight like humans. You think wars are won with overwhelming force. Humans? We win with strategy. The ship's alarm blared, signaling enemy approach. Kale glanced at the tactical display, 6 Union dreadnoughts, 2 interceptors, and a full contingent of drop ships. They weren't just containing information. They were erasing it. Zalron hesitated. Even if we escape, where will we go? Kale checked the magazine on his pistol. I've got a hunch this little message was meant for someone. Someone who left something behind. We follow the breadcrumbs. The communications panel flickered as a Union officer's voice cut through the static, deep and guttural. Unidentified vessel, you are carrying classified intelligence. Power down and prepare for immediate boarding. Kale smirked. Boarding? That's cute. He turned to Zalron. Get to the engine bay. Override the safety protocols. I'll buy us time. Zalron hesitated, his mandibles twitching. You intend to hold off an entire Union strike team? Alone? Kale grinned, rolling his shoulders. You ever seen a cornered human? Before Zalron could argue, Kale was already moving. He reached the airlock just as the Union's boarding clamps engaged. Heavy metal thuds. Hissing pressure valves. The scent of ozone. The doors groaned as they were breached. Kale stood in the center of the dimly lit corridor, pulse rifle steady in his grip. The first alien through was a Dracian shock trooper, thick armor plating, for burning yellow eyes scanning the room. Behind him, 2 Garath commandos, all muscle, no brains. Kale didn't wait. A single shot through the Draxian's eye socket sent the brute crashing. Before the others reacted, Kale ducked, pivoted, fired. The first Garath staggered back with a gaping wound in its gut. The second lunged, Kale twisted, drove a blade under its ribs, and yanked hard. A third soldier charged from the breach. Kale pivoted and snapped his pistol up. One shot. Straight through the throat. The corridor filled with the scent of burning flesh and blood. Kale wiped his blade against his vest. More were coming. Good. He turned, sprinting toward the secondary hatch just as a shock grenade detonated behind him. The concussive blast slammed into his back, knocking the air from his lungs. He hit the ground hard, rolling just in time to avoid the volley of plasma fire that tore through the corridor where he'd been standing. Kale slid behind a bulkhead, breathing heavy. Zalron, he growled into his calm. Tell me you've got that override. Working, almost there. Zalron's voice came through, strained. A massive Union enforcer stepped through the breach, a walking fortress, reinforced plating, a plasma repeater mounted to its shoulder. Kale exhaled. You ugly bastard! The enforcer opened fire. Kale dove forward, tucking into a roll as plasma bolts ripped through the walls behind him. He came up on one knee, fired a burst straight at the enforcer's leg joints. The armor was thick, but not impenetrable. Sparks flew as the enforcer staggered. No hesitation. Kale was already moving. He sprinted forward, dodging the wide sweep of a gravity hammer, leaped onto the enforcer's armored knee, and fired point-blank into its visor. The enforcer collapsed with a groan, its weapon sparking uselessly as Kale landed on its chest and emptied another round into its head. More enemies flooded in. Kale ducked into a side corridor. His comm crackled. Engines online! Zalron's voice rang through. Initiating warp in 10 seconds! Kale grinned, pushing off the bulkhead. Hold on to your exoskeleton. A squad of elite Union operatives turned the corner ahead, rifles raised. Kale dove, rolled, spun, fired. A controlled burst took out the lead operative. He grabbed the second's weapon, ripped it from their hands, and used it to club the third across the face. The deck lurched beneath them as the engines roared to life. A countdown blared through the ship. 5 seconds. Kale slammed his elbow into an alien's throat, using their body as a shield against incoming fire. 4 seconds. He grabbed a pulse grenade from the dead enforcer's belt and primed it. 3 seconds. Kale sprinted toward the nearest airlock control panel. 2 seconds. The grenade beeped, flashing red. 1 second. Kale punched the airlock release. The entire corridor depressurized instantly. Bodies, weapons, debris, all sucked into the void. Kale slammed his back against the wall, gripping the safety railing as the explosive decompression roared around him. His feet dangled inches from the open vacuum, then the airlock sealed shut. He dropped to the deck, breathing hard. The ship lurched. The warp drive engaged. They were gone. Kale exhaled, pushing himself up. His arms ached. His ribs burned. He tapped his comm. Status? Zalron's voice came through, strained but alive. We're clear. The Union will pursue us, but we have a head start. Kale wiped sweat from his forehead, smirking despite the pain. Then let's make it count. Zalron hesitated. You realize what this means, human? Kale glanced out the viewport, the stars streaking past as they hurled toward the next piece of the puzzle. He grinned. Yeah. It means we're just getting started. The ship hurtled through the void, systems straining as it broke away from the Union's pursuit net. Inside the dim cockpit, Cale stood with arms crossed, his gaze locked onto the flickering holomap. The coordinates stolen from the monolith led to a dead sector, a place even the Union had long abandoned. That alone made it interesting. Zalron's claws tapped against the console, his mandibles twitching as he processed the readings. This sector is listed as uninhabitable. No star systems, no planetary bodies, no resource signatures. There is nothing. Cale's fingers drummed against his belt. Then why was it in the monolith's data? No civilization puts coordinates on a wall unless they lead somewhere. Zalron hesitated. If there is something there, it has remained undetected for eons. Cale smirked. Or someone wanted it that way. The ship's warning klaxons blared. Proximity alarms. Something massive sat ahead, deep within the void. The screen displayed nothing. No planetary body, no ship signatures. Just empty space. But the ship's sensors were screaming. Cale's voice was low. Drop us out. Zalron flicked the controls. The stars steadied, the ship lurching from warp, and suddenly, there it was. An impossible structure, floating in the abyss. A station? A derelict city? It stretched for miles, dark and ancient, massive rings orbiting its core, fragments of dead ships drifting in the debris field. The architecture was like nothing Cale had ever seen. Zalron's mandibles twitched. This should not exist. Cale leaned forward, eyes narrowing. And yet here we are. The sensors flickered erratically. Zalron adjusted them, his posture rigid. I am detecting no power signatures. No life. But the structure, it is intact. It is waiting. Cale pushed off the console. Then let's knock. The docking clamps groaned as the ship latched onto the structure's outer ring. Cale stepped into the airlock, adjusting the grip on his rifle, rolling his shoulders. Zalron hesitated at the hatch, eyes scanning Cale's stance. You suspect danger? Cale exhaled. I suspect a lot of things. The doors hissed open, revealing dark corridors, silent halls of metal and stone. No dust. No decay. It was as if the place had simply paused. Zalron's claws scraped the floor as he followed. This technology predates the Union by millions of years, yet it is preserved. Functional. Cale touched a control panel. It lit up. The ship-wide systems hummed. The walls pulsed with faint power, as if waking from a long sleep. Zalron's mandibles twitched. It recognizes you. Cale stepped back, eyes narrowing. No. It recognizes humanity. The doors at the far end of the corridor groaned open. Inside lay a central chamber, a circular platform surrounded by what looked like stasis pods, each towering and built for beings much larger than any species in the known galaxy. Zalron's voice was hushed. This is a vault. Cale approached the nearest pod. It was empty, the glass cracked. Something had left it long ago. He turned to the control panel, scanning the symbols. They weren't just similar to the monolith's text, they were identical. His voice came out steady. This place belonged to the Ancient Ones. Zalron's claws flexed. Then this is a graveyard. Cale shook his head. No. This was a last stand. He turned back to the console, hands moving over the interface. It reacted instantly, data streams rushing through the screens, the entire structure shuddering. The message played. It wasn't audio, nor text. It was a memory. A projection, flooding their minds with fragmented images. War. An empire spanning galaxies, falling to ruin. The cycle, the Great Reset, an extermination pattern across eons. Cale clenched his jaw. They fought it. Zalron's breath came shallow. And lost. A final image burned into his mind, a symbol. A marker, written in that same ancient script. Not a name, not a phrase. A designation. Zalron stumbled back. That is your world. Kale's breath caught in his chest. The projection was clear. The symbol, the same found on the earliest human ruins, deep beneath Earth's surface. The ancient ones had known Earth. Had marked it. Kale's voice was hollow. We weren't just the last survivors of the cycle. We were part of the war before it. The console pulsed, revealing something buried in the system's core. A command sequence. Locked. Waiting. Kale touched the screen. It unlocked. The station trembled, power surging to life. Zalron hissed, stepping back. What did you do? Kale's voice was calm. I think I just turned something back on. Outside, the void shifted. The darkness moved. And then the stars themselves blinked. The station's metal groaned as power surged through ancient circuits, systems rebooting for the first time in untold millennia. Kale steadied himself as the tremors passed through the structure, his pulse quickening. The vault wasn't just waking up, it was responding. To him. To humanity. Zalron's mandibles clicked in alarm as his claws danced over his scanner. Power levels spiking across all systems. I am detecting gravitational distortions outside. Something is forming. Kale turned sharply, his instincts screaming a warning. Define forming. Zalron's eyes flickered in disbelief. A construct. It was hidden, embedded within the void itself. The station is calling it back. Kale's gut twisted. And you're just telling me now? Before Zalron could answer, the comms panel crackled to life. The voice that came through was distorted, not entirely organic. You were never meant to return. Kale's grip on his rifle tightened. Who the hell am I talking to? The station shook violently as a surge of energy erupted from its core, illuminating the chamber with eerie golden light. You awaken that which was buried. You reach where you should not. The cycle will not be broken. Kale's heart pounded. The voice wasn't just ancient, it was aware. The hollow display flickered, revealing an incoming fleet. Union warships, dozens of them, dropping out of warp like a noose tightening around their location. Kale's jaw clenched. Damn it! Zalron cursed under his breath. They tracked us. We are outnumbered 100 to 1. Kale exhaled, a slow smirk creeping onto his face. So they're scared. The voice from the station hissed. You do not understand. They do not fear you. They fear what you will find. Kale's mind raced. The Union wasn't here to fight, they were here to erase everything. He turned to Zalron. Can we activate the station's defenses? Zalron's claws tapped frantically at his scanner. The systems are responsive, but locked. They require a command key, something organic. Something living. Kale's pulse slammed against his ribs. The console had reacted to him. He took a slow breath. What happens if I give it the command? The voice echoed. The cycle will fight back. Kale grinned. Then let's give it something to fight. He stepped forward, pressing his hand against the console. The station answered. Light flared, machinery roaring to life. Outside, the void ripped open, unveiling a hidden armada, massive warships, buried within pocket dimensions for eons, each one adorned with symbols older than known history. Zalron's voice was a whisper. These ships, they are not Union. They are not anything. Kale watched the display as the ancient warships turned their weapons on the Union fleet. The station's voice was final. Then the war begins again. The first salvo was fired. The first blast tore through the void like a lance of fire, striking a Union dreadnought head-on. The warship's shields collapsed in an instant, its hull splitting apart as molten debris scattered in all directions. Silence followed, a moment of pure disbelief, before the rest of the fleet responded with chaotic urgency. Plasma turrets swiveled, missile bays opened, and the war truly began. Kale braced himself as the station rumbled, its ancient systems surging with power. Zalron's mandibles twitched as he studied the readouts, his voice sharp with tension. The station is deploying automated defenses. These ships, they are fighting as if they remember a war that ended before history began. Kale exhaled, his hands tightening into fists. Maybe because it never did. The Union fleet retaliated, bombarding the station with relentless precision. Explosions rippled across the construct's surface, but the ancient defenses held. Warships, sleek and unfamiliar, unfolded from the darkness like ghosts returning to a battlefield long abandoned. Their hulls bore no insignias, no allegiance, only the grim, unyielding presence of a force built for destruction. Zalron's claws moved over his console, his tone shifting to something dangerously close to awe. These ships, they are not merely weapons. They are executing a strategy. Coordinated. Calculating. His gaze snapped to Cale. They are following you. Cale felt it too. The weight of something unseen pressing against his mind. The station, the fleet, it wasn't just a remnant. It was waiting for the right hand to take control. And it had chosen him. A sharp chime cut through the chaos. An incoming hail. Cale activated the channel. A figure appeared, High Marshal Tyn of the Galactic Union, his reptilian face coiled with barely contained fury. Human, he spat, the word dripping with contempt. You do not understand what you are unleashing. Cale leaned forward, his voice cold. You knew about this place. About the cycle. How long has the Union been covering it up? Tyn's eyes narrowed. Long enough to know that you are playing with fire that will consume everything. His gaze flickered to the battle behind Cale. Do you truly believe these relics will serve you? They are machines built for a single purpose, to wage war without end. You cannot control them. Cale's jaw tightened. Then why are they following me? Tyn's voice darkened. Because the last time, they followed your kind. The words landed like a blow. Cale's pulse pounded. He had suspected. He had seen glimpses in the vault's memory transfer. But hearing it confirmed by the Union's highest authority? Humanity had been here before. They had been part of the war. And they had been erased. Tyn's expression hardened. If you continue down this path, the cycle will reset. The Harbinger will come. And it will not distinguish between friend or foe. It will purge everything. Cale met his stare without flinching. Then maybe it's time someone broke the cycle. Tyn exhaled, something between frustration and grim finality. Then you leave me no choice. The transmission cut. Outside, the Union fleet shifted. New formations. A final, desperate play. Zalron's claws dug into the console. They are preparing for a full-scale annihilation strike. If they cannot contain this place, they will burn it. The station. The ships. Us. Cale stared at the display, the countless lives balanced on the edge of extinction. This war wasn't about the Union anymore. Not about politics, not about control. This was about humanity's right to exist. He turned to the control panel, exhaling slowly. He could feel it now, the station's presence, vast and patient, waiting for his command. Cale's voice was quiet, but unshakable. Then let's end it. His hands moved over the interface, instincts guiding him. A new command sequence appeared, one the station had never activated before. The fleet around them shifted, weapons retracting, new pathways unlocking. The true power of the Ancient Ones coming online. Cale smiled. Let's see how you like fighting something older than your gods. The station's weapons charged, energy cascading through conduits untouched for 1,000,000 years. A final transmission flickered across the displays, one last message left behind by those who came before. We were never the end. We were the beginning. Cale looked to the void, where the war was about to be decided. And he gave the order. Fire!